The Saga of ShaHaNon, Book 2, Emperors and Exiles. Chapter 2, Brosten. The ancient city of Brosten and the escape from the snow, crime, and duties of Kos had seemed like a welcome break for Orion, but what had promised to be a vacation was turning out to be anything but restful. He felt he stood out, that he was watched, even hunted. The crowd and crush of travelers on the street seemed to hide a threat that Orion couldn't quite name. A quick backstep saved him from getting soaked by a trade carriage that rushed past, far too fast for the crowded city in Orion's mind. A woman nearly stumbled into him in her own attempt to stay dry. She shot him a pretty smile before he could say anything about it, and was back on her way as if nothing had happened. He hated cities, crowds, and the politics that always went with them. But here he was. The vast city flowed down from the high hills of Ferwa to a great open harbor. The harbor itself was always a cluster of ships, traders, fishermen, and pearl hunters, their masts clanging with warning bells as they vied for position. Even up in the city markets with four-story buildings all around, the sound was still heard. Like the ships, the streets were as diverse as any could be. Elves in their layered robes of reds and yellows, pastel greens and pinks, swept about with haughty grace. Dwarves in glittery, gem-encrusted attire strode with purpose, while humans from every continent filled all the spaces. There were Dakans in 100 shades of brown, fair-skinned Ramdellans, short red-haired Ava Wrens, and 1,000 mixes of each. Amid them all, here and there, were Purtons. They ghosted through the city as a whisper of a reminder that it was their people who had built the cities and empire of Purt to begin with. The only races Orion had not seen were Azeran and Pusan, but the massive size of the city certainly could hide them, even if they were present. Languages were as varied as the people, blurring and blending into a constant babble that made it difficult to separate one from another. Smells from the markets, the eateries, and the taverns were wonderful at times and foul at others as they wafted about the city. Poverty and wealth walked side by side in the streets that were filled with people almost every hour of the day. The city guard patrolled every street and kept a sense of secure order that was rare in a city so large and diverse. Orion pulled his hood up over his gray hair and wondered if the young woman had guessed who he was or if she was just polite. She had seemed rather too nice to have not recognized him. Again, the sense that he was known and that a stalking darkness was smirking at him through the eyes of strangers returned. He grumbled at his own paranoia and let it pass. He moved quickly up the street. As much as he hated the congestion of the crowds, he could vanish into them and lose even a demon in such a city as this. That was some reassurance, but he longed for the deep forests and ancient mountains of the northern border of the empire. He slipped through the foot traffic, accepting brushing touches to help hide and diffuse his own energy trail. Every step he watched for pickpockets, not that they could get anything he had, but he was aware all the same. He paused in an alley, pushed his hood off and pulled on a black cap, stuffing his hair up under it. He waited, shifted his shields, and changed his direction. Stepping out into the crowd, he went back the way he had come. Most days there was no direction to Orion's wanderings in this massive city. His route had no destination, so he was free to truly pick his path at random. Here, he had no paperwork, no court cases, no funerals, nothing to do, and yet he just could not relax. He had tried, but the more he stayed still, the more uneasy he felt. Restlessness and a short temper forced him to keep moving. Today, he was meeting Jamie, and had spent the day making sure no one followed him to that meeting. His mind tried to understand his paranoia, to slow down, to ask why he was always feeling hunted or watched. At times he was not certain if he was awake or on the verge of a nightmare, and that never helped. The more he tried to clear his head and his heart, the worse he felt. It had been that way for years, and seemed to be getting slowly more so. He muttered under his breath and ducked into a tavern and out the back door before he circled back around to the street. Things had not been good, not for him, not for his partner, and not for the friendship between them. A distance had been built that was as palpable as the shields blocking each other's magics. It all went back to that year they had lost each other, and while they never spoke of it, they never spoke of anything at all anymore. Orion was caught between nightmares and distraction. The change of pace and place had seemed a welcome relief, and yet Orion wandered the streets of Brosten feeling as torn and haunted as ever. Jamie was the reason they were here. He had been asked to teach basic healing to a class of city guards who seemed to hold a small measure of healing ability. The constable had worked for years to gain the chance to have his men trained, and Jamie had jumped at the opportunity to get out of Kos. While Jamie was off teaching, Orion was left to his own devices. Orion had to admit that that was really never a good idea anymore. He left the street for the small, quiet-looking tap room where he was supposed to meet his partner. It was an older building with great glass windows on the front and a warm rosewood interior with the classic tap room layout. Orion knew there would be 2 doors out the back and likely a third on the side wall into a small stable. The bar itself stood in the center of the room, with wooden kegs neatly stacked as an island down the middle space, with a counter over the kegs for rows of pitchers and heavy pint mugs. Brass taps gleamed in the light of the oil lamps, hinting at the variety of beers, ales, and dwarven whiskeys offered. All the more expensive drinks were kept in bottles under the bar top and out of easy reach for anyone with ideas of stealing one. The layout allowed for many people to get access to service at once, and yet was comfortable for smaller crowds as well. The place had likely once been rather grand, but now the windows were stained with a layer of fly spots, dust and grime, and the walls dulled with the soot of the oil lamps that burned night and day. There were a few old billiard tables in the back portion of the place, offering customers distraction. The crowd was all on the lower end of wealth, looking as tired and neglected as the building. Orion chose a stool at the back corner of the bar itself so he could watch the doors. There were plenty of tables, but none of them gave as many options of access to an exit and a view of the front. Sitting, he rested his elbows on the worn counter and waited for service. He ran his palm over the smooth surface of dark wood that was likely many centuries old. He could feel the wood, the warmth of it, the grain as it rose slightly out of the worn surface, and yet could not actually feel his hands. It was an odd sensation, as if he was wearing gloves of some sort. He had gotten accustomed to watching his own hands, as they were numb as often as not, and he continually fumbled and dropped things. It wasn't just his hands. He felt often as if he was wearing a body that was not his at all. He had not felt so uncomfortable in his own flesh since childhood. Back then, he had put his mind to mastering his body and had become a great warrior, but now he just felt old and confused. Jamie had given up trying to figure it out, and Orion didn't bring it up anymore. It didn't help that on his right hand was a silver ring with a lavender stone that he could not recall how he had gotten, yet could not bear to take it off. Once he had tried and found himself in tears, as if he had broken his own heart. Sometimes he had moments when he recalled flashes of the events that put that ring on his finger, but they flickered away the moment he tried to focus on them. Most of his life now felt like dreams that vanished away as soon as he attempted to recall the details. He scowled and tried to think of something, anything else.
"What can I get you?"
the man at the counter asked. He was a mixed blood, part human, part Pertan, and likely a little elven in there somewhere as well. He was a tall man, handsome enough with curly light brown hair. He had a smile and an easy manner, but still, Orion felt uneasy with him.
"Whiskey, whatever the house has,"
Orion said to the barkeeper. Orion knew it wouldn't be long until Jamie found him. He could already feel his partner getting close. Orion turned to watch a game of billiards. He had not played the game much at all, and not since he was a teenager, but he knew Jamie loved it. It was likely the reason they had come here.
"Remember the last time you played?"
Jamie asked, trying to startle Orion. Orion didn't even glance over. As guarded and on edge as he was, there was no way Jamie was going to manage to sneak up on him.
"No."
Orion lied. He looked over as Jamie leaned on the bar with his elbow. Orion didn't want to play, and he didn't want to think about the past either. He knew Jamie was going to suggest it, though.
Can I get a picture of the house ale and a couple mugs?
Jamie asked with his ever-charming smile. The blond man watched the game a moment.
You want to play now?
Jamie asked. He was out of uniform and had changed for a handsome vest and fine blouse. He looked to be a young noble, not the 90-year-old bishop that he was. Jamie was neither young nor nobility, but he appeared so with such ease, it was almost unsettling. Orion looked away from his partner and back to his battered hands. He took hold of his small glass of cloudy whiskey. He felt a little sick.
Not really,
Orion said before he took the shot.
Oh, come on, Ori,
Jamie said with a grin.
I haven't played in a decade or so.
He dug for coins for the pitcher he had ordered.
I take it you are having a good time teaching,
Orion said, as he pushed himself up, trying not to feel bitter about how miserable he was and how happy Jamie seemed.
Honestly, I am,
Jamie said seriously.
but I don't think that's the real reason why we're here, though.
He put the coins on the counter as the server brought the order.
Come play.
Orion sighed heavily but moved to the back, hoping to find a table that was in a corner and yet not trapped in. Jamie followed him with the mugs and pitcher. They found the back had several tables that were all but hidden from the front of the bar. Orion felt better about the place and relaxed a little. He tried to shake his nerves and enjoy himself. He poured mugs of ale as Jamie went to grab sticks from the side wall.
How's the class? Any talent?
Orion asked as Jamie returned.
A shocking amount,
Jamie said with a troubled scowl before he took a sip.
The laws against magic outside the priesthood are starting to go bad. These people should be master healers, most of them anyway. Several of them suffer terrible migraines for not knowing how to shield, and many have killed without knowing it. Lack of teaching is creating what the lack of teaching was supposed to prevent.
He shook his head as he moved to the table.
I think, though, that this group will do well with what I can teach them. It makes me think, maybe I should try to open a school. Why they ended up working as city militia is beyond me.
He shook his head as he set the balls into place. Orion leaned back on the table they had chosen.
You might be able to stay on here and teach.
He folded his arms across his chest. He shifted to make sure the table was solid enough to roll back onto if a fight happened, and he let his eyes scan for all exits and possible weapons.
Maybe there is a need for you healers to protect yourselves. You are a great healer, and you chose a militant life. You could have chosen a gentler kingdom in the church than the sixth. It seems to me that many of you tend to be warriors if you are cut off from the chance to be safe by other means.
He spoke out loud to himself, more than to Jamie, but it made sense.
Maybe you really should think about a school.
Not likely,
Jamie said sadly, stepping back from the table.
If the church wanted me doing such, I would have been doing it already. They want us right where they have us.
All but under house arrest in the poorest city in Pert.
Orion grumbled in agreement. Jamie handed Orion a stick, and he moved to the table. Orion took aim. He focused a moment. He hated this game, but he was good at it, or had been once. In days gone past, it had been the game of lords, but it had moved down to even the slums in the last few centuries. Orion had learned it with gold-etched sticks, marble balls, and ivory-inlaid tables. Jamie had learned it as well, but by street rules on tavern sticks.
It took a lot of time and strings to get us here at all,
Jamie said.
Make no mistake, someone wants us here, and it's not the church.
Orion looked up at his partner without taking his shot yet.
Who?
He asked. Jamie took a sip, leaning back on the table where Orion had been, with an ease that seemed at odds with the topic he had brought up.
Take your shot. If I'm right, they'll be here soon enough,
he said. Orion took aim and started the game. No balls dropped into the pockets, and he passed over the bar stick to Jamie. He was glad nothing had dropped. They were not here to play. They were here to meet someone. Games of billiards was just a cover. Win too fast, and it would draw in other players who wanted serious games, and they didn't need that just now.
I was thinking we might go to the theatre while we are here,
Jamie said, taking his shot.
Why?
Orion asked.
because it may be a long time before we get the chance again.
Jamie gave him a dirty look.
I would like to go. Would you like to join me?
Orion sighed, folding his arms over his chest.
You know how I feel about such political gatherings.
Orion hated the world of the wealthy and avoided it as much as he could. Going to such a place on purpose seemed like a very bad idea.
Yes, you poor baby. You might run into someone you know.
Not in Brosten, but I might lose my temper and get arrested again.
Jamie laughed to himself at the memory of the last time Orion had lost his temper in public. Several church marshals had arrested him and hauled him to the cardinal to be questioned for his mental stability. It had happened several times in the last years.
That was well warranted,
Jamie said, amused.
I'm sorry you got arrested, but it was funny.
I'm really tired of being arrested.
It was warranted that time, but while Jamie thought it all amusing, he had no idea how unstable Orion felt most of the time. Orion knew he wasn't going crazy, but he certainly wasn't the man he had been 20 years ago. He wasn't even the man he had been a decade ago. Whatever had happened to him in that missing year, it had changed him on a level so deep, not even he understood what it might be.
You know they do it on purpose to keep you from being a political figure, don't you?
Jamie said, as he aimed for a second shot. Orion knew that he was targeted and watched, forced to stay down or be made an example of. He hated that it worked, that he was a story of the past and not any part of the current minds of the people. If it was just a political game, he would be as public as he could, just to be spiteful. But his life was not that simple. There was something in his head that was worth having him not remember, or worth a great deal of power to make him forget. The last thing he wanted was for whatever it was to be known. He wondered at times if even he wanted to know what had happened to him. He knew that the story that had manifested was wrong. He had no doubt of that, but he could not prove his feelings about it. Jamie missed and handed back the stick to Orion.
I know, Jay,
he said softly. Jamie shook his head.
You play their game well then.
Maybe,
Orion admitted. He moved to take a shot at the black and white balls, focusing his gaze on the lone red ball for his next shot. It was odd to just be with Jamie. They didn't do that anymore. They were always working. They just passed each other in the halls, rarely if ever talking. After 30 years alone in dangerous territory with no one else to talk to, they had once been unable to be at ease unless the other was close. But now that had changed. Whatever had happened went into the soul and was not just the lack of memory. Something was lost that could not be regained, and Orion was afraid to face it for fear it would destroy his soul-bound partner. 10 years ago, Orion had woken up from nightmares in a bed, in a healer's small house with Jamie at his bedside. He had stumbled out of the woods, unkempt and incoherent, before he passed out at the door of a woodcutter who had brought him to the healer. The healer told Orion that they had no idea who he was when he first arrived at the healing house. It wasn't until Jamie identified him did the healer know. Jamie's search had found him in that bed, in a coma. Orion had reports in his pack, all of them seemingly perfect and backed up, and yet Orion knew in his heart that he had not written them, nor walked those paths. Whatever had happened, someone had gone to a lot of trouble to hide the events of that missing year from the church. They didn't talk for the rest of the game, as their own thoughts filled their heads, and they just picked at the balls with only half effort. Orion kept thinking back to how he had once, not so long ago, been seen as a great hero of the northern border, only to be shunned now by the church and forgotten by the people. The pontiff himself had interrogated Orion about that year, and though he had studied the reports, he seemed to believe them as little as Orion did. After that, Orion and Jamie had been promoted to bishops and sent to Kos, that rat-hole, filthy, disease-infested mining camp of a city. Orion almost snarled at the thought of it. The game of politics was being played about him, and now he just reacted to it all, letting it happen. Jamie went to refill the pitcher and returned with 2 men.
Orion, this is Constable Tyven,
He said of the Purton man who nodded politely,
and Bishop Gallus.
as he nodded to the white-haired, bearded old man who smiled and put out his hand.
It's nice to meet you finally. I told James that you are both welcome to stay at my house while in Brosten. The inns can be a bit rowdy at times here. I'd be happy to have you.
the bishop said.
It is an idea.
Orion said. He took hold of the man's hand in polite manner and felt for a moment as if the world had spun a bit too fast. It seemed as if he should know who this man was, and almost as if he had met him. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, he almost heard someone whisper to him, but it was something he just couldn't catch. The moment passed, and the old man was just a happy, round-bellied man in his later years with sparkling eyes and an easy smile. Orion blamed his earlier shot of whiskey on the odd feeling.
You followed?
Tyven asked Jamie.
Sure,
Jamie said with a shrug.
but I lost them well before I got in the area here.
It took us longer.
Tyven said.
I had to change clothes, and anyway, I'm glad you both made it.
Let me go get us drinks.
The bishop said cheerfully.
I'll be right back.
He toddled off to get drinks as the constable took a seat at the table.
So, what's this about?
Jamie asked softly.
I wish I knew exactly how to answer that.
Tyven replied.
That's why I wanted to get you two here. I'm an officer of the law. I don't study magic or such. I turn to wizards and priests for that. However, when I did last time, the church washed it up. They denied the whole thing happened, and as odd as it seemed, I let it rest. The first time. The second time, they were there just after us, took all the sketches and sent us off. They cleaned it up, not so much as an energy mark left. The reaction I got trying to get answers was, shall we say, cold.
Cold? Ha ha ha.
The bishop chuckled as he rejoined them with a pitcher of cider and one of dark ale.
What I got was cold. What you got was something much different.
So you figured out how to get us here under other pretenses?
Jamie asked.
We'd already been trying for the classes. It worked well enough.
Tyven said.
Why?
Orion asked as the bishop filled his mug.
Because,
The bishop said carefully.
Because why? Why us and for what?
Orion pressed.
Do you have any idea how little it takes for me to get arrested and picked apart? They want me to come off as unstable and crazy.
You are.
Jamie said with a sweet smile.
You're just mean enough to get away with it.
Orion shot his partner a cold look.
I'm half afraid to even mention the exact details of it. I don't know who might be listening for such key words.
Tyven said.
Before you even say another word, I need to know why you would go to the trouble to get us.
Orion pressed. The old bishop sat carefully in the battered chair.
Armand told me to.
He said, a bit hesitantly. Orion might have expected many things, but not that.
Armand?
He queried, about ready to get up and leave. The bishop nodded.
He comes to me now and then. He said you would think I am lying.
You are a priest. You do believe in Armand, don't you?
Tyven asked, concerned.
I believe in Armand just fine, but he has not so much as whispered a word in 10,000 years. Why now? Why of us? I find it unlikely we are so grand as to warrant such.
The bishop shifted a little in his chair.
I do not ask questions.
He said apologetically.
You ask a lot of us.
Jamie said.
You bring us in to try to figure out something we know the church does not want us looking at, and then ask us to believe that it is Armand's will we do. That's not easy to accept.
I still have nightmares of the scenes.
Tyven said softly.
I have been on the streets as constable for over 60 years and seen nothing like it. I've had men go into shock after seeing it. I've had hardened men get sick and have to leave. This is not something simple. This is very ugly and very bad. I fear the church is doing nothing about it. Worse, that they are hiding it.
Evil has walked in the holy places of this city. I cannot pinpoint it, but it has stood in the churches and hides so well, I fear it wears the face of a priest.
The bishop said, with a sadness that could not be faked.
The cardinal pretends it is nothing but a vampire,
He continued.
I fear he is either fooled or is in on it.
I had a secretary do sketches of the last event I hope to show you, but he's not an artist trained and was very short on time. The artists of the earlier ones tried to make the best they could from memory, but they are quick sketches. I also have a map with the places marked.
Tyven slid a black folder over to Orion.
Do what you want with them.
Ah, good now. Back to the game, shall we?
Gallus said happily.
I do love a good game.
Orion got up to make a few shots that accidentally dropped Jamie's balls, allowing Jamie to win the game. Orion took a seat at the table. The constable watched the game and the door while Orion opened the folder. Inside, on the top, were several requests for different students of art who needed a patron. Orion was aware that the constable had put them in there to hide what was the true purpose of the folder. Below the funds requests were the details of what they faced. The sketches were flawed and far from image captures, but they were enough to see that there was magic involved. Magic of a dark sort that included bodies of the dead. Orion's gut tightened as he looked at them. His eyes kept going back to odd details that seemed of importance, but he had no idea what it was about, those points that kept drawing his attention. He slid it all back together and into the folder.
I will look at them closer,
Orion said, as he closed it and slid the folder into his deep inner vest pocket.
You're recommending these artists honestly?
Yes,
Tevan said.
they are all good young people who just need a little help to be great.
I do not normally pull on my family's resources,
Orion said honestly.
but I will look into it.
Thank you, I hate to bother you with such things, but I have sought aid for them, and with you here, it was Jamie's idea.
He added. The bishop had Jamie laughing as they played another game. The old man cheered as he won and clapped his hands like a child. Jamie laughed as well and shook his head in shock at whatever had happened. Orion wasn't laughing, he was ready to move. He felt watched and hunted again. Despite that, he stayed and tolerated the small tavern for several more games before he rose at the end of one, leaving the bishop and the constable to play each other.
I'm headed back. You staying?
Orion asked Jamie.
No, I have class in the morning and am not as young as I was once. Good night, gentlemen.
They left the tavern together, made their way from the door, and crossed the street. Out of habit, they used the shadows to move, picked a route, then once they might be overlooked, veered off it to take another. They drew up hoods and picked up the stride of young men. In effect, they would seem to have vanished between one streetlight and the next.
How bad is it?
Jamie asked softly.
I don't feel so unwarranted about how uneasy I've been.
Orion muttered. They took a sharp turn down a dark side street and cut up another to a brightly lit main throughway, slowing down into an easy walk.
That bad?
Jamie asked with no humor in his tone at all.
The sketches aren't great, but they are enough. Add to it the fact of how difficult it had to be for a bishop and a constable to get us here. It's not good.
I will get out of class early tomorrow. They have drills that they all have to be at. Where should I meet you?
At the smallest, darkest tavern on Harbour Street.
You don't know the name of it yet?
Orion didn't respond to his partner's comment. There was truth and a hint of bitterness in it, but Orion ignored it. Jamie had his own flaws and vices. Orion might have gotten a bit dark in the last few years, but every time he failed to watch his back, he ended up in cuffs.
Don't come as yourself,
Orion said after another turn. They split up to get back to their inn at different times by different routes. Some habits didn't need to be spoken of and were so much a part of their lives, they were not about to change them.